this is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing my fancy booktube hat, and today I'm bringing you a slightly delayed wrap-up for everything I read in January except for the DiverseAthon. I have already done a wrap-up for the DiverseAthon. I posted that right at the beginning of this month, so I'll leave the link for you in the description if you want to find out what I read during the DiverseAthon. This is going to be 6 books. One of them I've already done a review for, one of them I owe you a review for, so those two are going to be fairly brief. This seems like I read a lot of books in January, but several of these books were books that I started or got most of the way through in December and only finished in January. And I think that part of the reason I've been a little intimidated to film this wrap-up for the past couple weeks is that some of these are books that I felt really, meh about, and I have a sort of hard time sometimes figuring out why I feel meh about a book and being able to articulate that, but I think I'll be able to just plow through most of this wrap-up. Anyhow, the first book I finished in the month was one that I read most of in December, and I finished it on January 1st. I've already done a review of this. This is When the Moon Was Ours by McLemore. This is young adult magical realism. It is absolutely gorgeous, and I totally loved it. I gave it 5 stars. I would encourage you to go check out my review to hear all of my thoughts on it. Next, I finally finished an audiobook that I'd been plugging through on audiobook CD for a couple of months, and that is The Lake House by Kate Morton. Kate Morton, I know, is one of my mom's favorite authors, so I've been meaning to read her books. This is her most recent novel. I think it came out in 2015. I still plan on reading more of her work because I know my mom says that a couple other of her books are better than this one. But this is one of the books that I felt really meh about, as is evidenced, I think, by the fact that it took several months for me to listen to it on audiobook. Part of that is just that it's really long. I was listening to it on CD, and it's 21 hours and 24 minutes. I think in print this is longer than most of Kate Morton's other books. I haven't really checked the statistics on that, but it looks pretty chunky. But I think the reason I have a hard time explaining why I felt meh about this book is that there are clearly lots of things about Kate Morton's writing that really appeal to me. I've been reading a lot of SFF lately, not a ton of historical fiction, mystery stuff, but I do enjoy that. This is a sort of more literary mystery, historical fiction thing. Part of it takes place in what's essentially the present day, and then it goes back to explore the angles of the mystery in the book from different time periods. It's a narrative that jumps back and forth, weaving in and out of time, and that's a narrative style I really enjoy. It's got this family history stuff going on that I liked, and even, I think, the parts of it that felt a little gimmicky, like the ending kind of feels a little gimmicky, I think you could throw that accusation at it, is a type of contrived ending that I personally enjoy in other stories quite a lot. We follow a police detective called Sadie Sparrow, and we know that she's having some professional problems with her job and with a case that got under her skin, and we know that she did something unprofessional in handling that case, and so she's removing herself from the scene. She's visiting her grandfather in Cornwall. While she's there, she stumbles upon this cold case to do with the old Edivane house, and she starts to investigate what happened to the missing boy Theo Edivane many years ago. Also in the present day, we have Alice Edivane, who is one of the sisters of the missing boy from the cold case, and she has become a very famous and well-known mystery author, but there are ghosts of the past that she has not faced. One of the things that bugged me about the writing was how Kate Morton would kind of make it so that if it were convenient for a character to have heard of Alice Edivane, the famous author, or, this case that Sadie was working on before she left London, or, the mystery of the missing Edivane boy, and then if it was convenient for a character to, of course, know about that, then, of course, that's famous, I've heard about that. And then if it was convenient for the character to have not known about these things, then no one would know about that thing. Which left me feeling that in the present age, where there's presumably Google and things, a lot of the connections that take a long time to be made by characters in this book should not have taken that long, and, someone should have connected the famous author Edivane with the Edivane house and the cold case, because presumably she has all of these literary fans who are so interested to know why she writes mysteries. I don't know. But I think in the long run, part of my problem with this book was just that it took a really long time, and I felt like there wasn't necessarily enough of interest here to sustain so many, false theories, and then going back in time and showing all the scenes between different people in different time periods that could support this next theory that we have about the case, when I can look at the book and say, oh, I'm only 2/3 of the way through, this can't possibly actually be the answer to the whodunit, because, I've still got 1/3 of the book left. The audiobook is narrated by Caroline Lee. I thought one of the really great things about the audio narration was how well she was able to slip between different narrative voices for different time periods, so you could tell in the way she switched her manner of speech that you had gone back in time and about how far you had gone back in time, which I thought was really clever, given that one of the things you lose listening to a book like this on audio is the fact that if you, space out for a little while, you might miss the chapter heading that tells you when and where you are, and then it's too hard to go back and figure it out. So yeah, there were things I really liked about this, and there were things I liked about Kate Morton's writing style, but I only gave this 3 stars. I am going to keep trying Kate Morton's books, though. The next one I'm planning on reading is The Secret Keeper, which my mom says is the best. And I'm going to read that one in print. The next book I have here is one for which I still owe you a review, and I do plan on having a review up for this by the end of the month, and that's The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. This was a January release. I read this advance copy around the time it was released, and I'm planning on doing a double review of this and Binti Home, which I read for the DiverseAthon. I really liked this. I gave it 4 stars. It's a historical fantasy novel set in medieval Russia that's not yet Russia at this time period, and part of what was really interesting for me is it's a period of history in that part of the world that I don't really know much about, and so with some of the author's notes and the glossary at the end and stuff, I got to learn some stuff about this time period and place. I was under the impression when I picked this up that it was a retelling of a Russian fairy tale. I'm not sure that's true. I think that this is inspired by Russian fairy tales, but I think it's an original story that involves Russian fairy tale creatures and characters. I'm not going to go into great detail about this here. I do want to say, though, that this has gotten a lot of comparison to Uprooted. I want to point out what's similar and what's different for me. The sort of Eastern European fairy tale inspiration is similar, although I feel like The Bear and the Nightingale feels a whole lot more like an actual adult fairy tale, whereas Uprooted felt like a kind of run-of-the-mill fantasy book with some of those trappings. Uprooted also felt like it was angling more at a YA readership. Even though it was marketed as adult, the writing style felt sort of YA-ish. This feels much more genuinely adult to me because it doesn't have, like, the action-y stuff, so it's a bit of a slower read. This book also has no romance, so if one of the things you liked about Uprooted was the romance, you might not like this as much, but if you're one of the many people who didn't like the romance in Uprooted so much, you may prefer The Bear and the Nightingale. Me, I liked both books, but I liked them differently. I gave this 4 stars, and I'll talk more specifically about the story of this book in my review, because that's, I think, going to take a little longer than I want to spend on it here. The next book I read was a cute little Victorian whodunit, Death at Dartmoor, a Victorian mystery by Paige. I've been making my way over several years through this series along with my mom. We've sort of been reading them together. They're not brilliant, but they're pretty reliable, and I know what to expect from them, and I generally enjoy them. This one, however, was a disappointment for me. This follows Kate and Charles on a visit to Dartmoor, where Charles is going to help set up a fingerprinting system for the inmates at the prison. There's an escape, there's a murder. Honestly, the main plots of these books are not really the reason I like to read them. The reason I like to read them is because of the sort of historical trivia that the authors, Paige is a pseudonym for a husband and wife writing team, that they insert into the story. And I found that really lacking in this, so the things that were kind of glaringly not well written about the mystery stood out a whole ton more to me than they normally would in these books. This starts out having some interesting things to say about the history of prison conditions in Victorian times that were really bad. It kind of throws that by the wayside, though, and what we really get in terms of historical trivia is we get Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as a character kind of bumbling around the moors, getting inspiration for The Hound of the Baskervilles. I've never read Hound of the Baskervilles, so that might be why some things that I was supposed to enjoy in this book were amiss for me. But I also feel like as this series has gone on, the character-driven plot arcs of the story have gotten weaker and weaker. The first few books had a really great romance arc between the two main characters. And once they're like settled and happily married, it feels like the authors were kind of grasping at straws for a few books to figure out where they were going to get, an actual story from for the characters. And it feels like in this book they almost just gave up. Like there isn't a character story arc happening for the main characters in this book at all. So I found that really disappointing. So I only gave this book 2 stars, which is, I don't know, it might be the lowest that I've given a book in this series. I think these are usually a pretty reliable 3 stars for me. The next book I read was Soul Music by Terry Pratchett. This is a Discworld book, and this is the 3rd in the Death sub-series of Discworld. You don't need to read Discworld books in order. I have been reading all of the sub-series in order as much as I can, and I've been finding that works for me. Each of Pratchett's books, kind of like those Victorian mysteries, sort of has a subject matter that he decides to take a spin on in the book. He does this much better. As a side note, does BookTube generally follow the, academic writing protocol of talking about authors in the present tense regardless of whether or not they're deceased? I do that kind of automatically just because that was how I was taught to write in college. I haven't really paid attention to whether or not that's BookTube standard. Anyhow, in this book, Pratchett introduces rock music to Discworld where it causes all sorts of magical havoc. I'm not a huge rock fan, so I was getting just enough of the jokes to realize there were probably a whole ton more that I wasn't getting, but I got enough of them that I enjoyed it quite a bit. In terms of the other elements of the storyline here that have to do with Death going missing and his granddaughter Susan being sort of swept up to take his place, these main plot elements felt really familiar to me from Mort and Reaper Man, which were the first 2 Death books, but I felt like this book was better as a whole than either of those, even though some of those story elements felt repetitive. But while Reaper Man felt like it really stood alone from Mort, it wasn't a direct sequel, this one feels like it kind of is, and you're not really going to appreciate everything in it in terms of the character backstory unless you've read Mort, which I thought this one was a better book. So that's a little frustrating for me, but I really did enjoy this one. I gave it 4 stars. The last book in the month I read was on my Kindle, and that was Thorn by Intisar Khanani. I started this during the DiverseAthon and finished it by the end of the month, although I did not finish it during the DiverseAthon week. This is a self-published young adult fairy tale retelling of the Goose Girl story. I started reading it during the DiverseAthon because Intisar Khanani is a Muslim-American author of Pakistani heritage, and I know that she's a strong advocate of diversity in books online. The book itself didn't strike me as having particularly diverse representation, though. The kingdom that the main character goes to, the people there are described as having a darker complexion than the kingdom that she comes from, but that was, I think, pretty much the extent of it. This felt like a really comfortable, easy read YA fairy tale retelling for me. It was very reminiscent of the type of books that I read in high school, and it was skillfully written. You hear a lot about people complaining that self-published books don't feel as polished or well-edited as traditionally published books. I didn't get any sense of that from this. This felt very professionally presented. This is about a princess named Alira from a very small kingdom, and one day the king of a very large and powerful kingdom arrives and arranges for her to be married to his son, so she has to travel to the big and powerful kingdom. Along the way, she is betrayed by her attending lady who is traveling with her, who teams up with this sorceress to get her body switched with Alira's, so everyone thinks that Alira is the attending lady and this other girl's gonna get to be the princess. When they arrive, of course, the princess is terrible and is terrible to Alira and makes her be the goose girl and all of that. The emotional journey in this story has to do with how Alira really ends up enjoying not having the responsibility of being the princess and having to have this arranged marriage that she didn't really want in the first place, and she'd kind of like to just disappear into being the goose girl, but she has to come to terms with the responsibilities that she has as a princess and the fact that some of those things may be worth fighting for. I really enjoyed this, and if you like a YA fantasy fairy tale standalone retelling, it's not super angsty, then I would suggest giving this a shot. If you want to try Intisar Khanani's writing to see if you'd like it, she has a short story that I think is free on Kindle called The Bone Knife that takes place in the same world as this book. I think it's meant to be a prequel to a series that she's working on but hasn't released yet. I read it a while before I read this book. The writing style gives you a pretty good idea of what her writing is like. So if you're on the fence, I'd recommend checking that story out. Anywho, that was all the things I read in January except for my DiverseAthon wrap-up, which you can also watch. Anyhow, let me know if you've read any of these books, let me know what you're reading, any of that good stuff. That is all. Bye for now.